I always believed that my marriage to Ethan was unbreakable, a bond that couldn't be shaken. 12 years together, this wasn't some fleeting thing. We had shared goals, a life rhythm we had fallen into, and traditions we had created along the way. We didn't need words to understand each other. We shared both the highs and lows, and through it all, we were not only partners but best friends and lovers. So when he casually suggested one quiet evening that I meet another man, it felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. We were sitting in our usual spot at the little cafe on the corner, where the soft glow from the street lamps made it feel like we were tucked away in a private corner of the bustling city. Ethan always preferred the table by the window to watch the people passing by, while I lost myself in his stories about the faces we saw. We had our usual coffee with cinnamon and almond syrup, our little ritual on those quiet evenings. But this time there was something different about the way he looked at me. His gaze was deeper, almost like there was something he wasn't saying. "Lily." He set down his cup and folded his hands in a way that made it clear he was about to have an important conversation. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. A wave of unease washed over me. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. His tone, so serious, was unlike him. Normally, Ethan was easygoing and full of smiles, but now his eyes held something more than just the usual lightheartedness. "We've been together a long time, and you know how much I love you," he continued, taking a deep breath as if bracing for something. "But I've been thinking about proposing something unconventional. I want you to meet another man." Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I froze, not knowing how to react, my mind suddenly paralyzed. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan gave a slight, almost nervous smile, attempting to mask his own unease, but I could see the same fear in his eyes that I was feeling. He held my gaze, almost as if trying to reassure me with his confidence. "It's not because I think something's missing. I love you and I always will. But I think we should try something different. Something that could bring us even closer." My thoughts spiraled in a whirlpool. Why? Why now? My heart was racing in my chest. On one hand, I trusted Ethan completely, but his suggestion shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Where had this idea come from? We had always been open and honest with each other, sharing everything. But this was new. This was terrifying. "Are you serious?" I asked, hoping I was misinterpreting what he was saying. "Absolutely," he replied, that strange mixture of fear and hope in his eyes. "It doesn't mean we have to do anything right away. I just want you to think about it. I believe it could change us for the better." We sat in silence and I stared at my coffee cup, gripping it tightly as though it could shield me from the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. The very idea of something like this seemed absurd. And yet, deep down, there was a strange flicker of excitement. What if Ethan was right? What if this really could change something between us? The thought was like a spark in the darkness. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. But one thing was painfully clear. The world I thought I understood had begun to crumble. After that evening, I couldn't find peace. Questions gnawed at me constantly. What was really going on? Why now? Why him? I kept going back and forth between wanting to ignore it and this odd curiosity that I couldn't shake. Ethan and I talked about it repeatedly, but with every conversation, I was left with more questions than answers. He was patient, explaining that this wasn't about drifting apart or changing, but about exploring something new together, something that might bring us closer. A week later, Ethan suggested we go to a private gathering for couples who were looking for something new. I agreed, more out of a desire to understand what was going through his mind than anything else. We arrived at a building on the city's outskirts, where dim lighting and soft jazz greeted us at the door. Inside it was cozy yet strange, with soft sofas and muted lighting. The conversations floated around us, creating an atmosphere where it felt easy to lose yourself. We went to the bar, ordered a glass of wine each, and Ethan suggested we take a walk. I felt like an outsider here. Yet there was something oddly freeing about the place. Ethan held my hand, and I searched his eyes for the confidence I was lacking. That's when I saw him. James, tall, with a light stubble and a smirk that seemed to hold some kind of secret. He blended in with the crowd, but there was something in his calm gaze that stood out. A confidence and interest, like he already knew who I was. We exchanged some casual pleasantries, but I could feel the tension under every word. "Want to step outside for some air?" he asked, and I nodded, feeling unable to say no. Outside, the cool night air hit my skin, and the city's distant sounds broke the quiet around us. James stopped, looked at me, and asked, "Have you ever done something just for yourself without worrying about what others expect?" His question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. After years of marriage and family life, I had forgotten what it was like to act without considering the consequences. My head screamed at me to stop, but my heart whispered something else, and before I could speak, James gently brushed my face. Suddenly, everything around us seemed to fade. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing against mine with an unhurried softness, as if testing whether I was ready. The kiss was more powerful than 1,000 words. It wasn't fiery or aggressive, but gentle, almost unexpectedly tender, like a calming wave brushing over the shore after a storm. In that moment, I felt both vulnerable and free, and all my doubts seemed to vanish, if only for a fleeting second. When the kiss ended, James simply smiled, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. We stood there in silence, but inside, emotions were awakening that I hadn't felt in ages. It wasn't so much about him, it was about me. About uncovering something within myself that had been buried for too long. We went back inside, where Ethan was waiting, observing us from a distance. I sat down next to him, and his gaze seemed to search my face, looking for an answer that wasn't there. I felt a mix of joy and guilt, but Ethan simply took my hand and smiled softly. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, unable to express the turmoil that was building inside. It was just a kiss, but it had shifted something inside of me. It wasn't about love or betrayal. It was about freedom, about realizing that sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zones to truly understand ourselves. After that night, everything felt different. Ethan and I drove home in complete silence, and even our cozy house felt unfamiliar. I looked at the familiar walls, the photos in the hallway, our bedroom with the bed linens I had carefully chosen, but now everything seemed to carry a new weight. James's question echoed in my mind. "Have you ever done something just for yourself?" The question became an obsession, a riddle I couldn't solve. I realized that for so long I had been living for others, caring for Ethan, managing work, tending to the house, but not caring for myself. But knowing this didn't bring clarity. If anything, it deepened my inner conflict. How could I keep going when the very boundaries I had relied on for so long were starting to crumble? Ethan could sense the change in me. We sat in the kitchen, drinking our morning coffee, and the silence between us was thick, almost palpable. He tried to keep up a conversation, but I could feel his eyes darting to mine, searching for an answer that I didn't have. "I don't want you to feel obligated or guilty," he said one night as we lay in bed. Each of us turned to our own side. "This shouldn't be a burden. I just want us to both discover something new within ourselves, not destroy what we already have." I stayed silent. I wanted to scream that I didn't understand what was happening to me, that I felt lost and no longer knew where the line between desire and fear even was. But instead, I just pulled the blanket tighter around me and pretended everything was fine. At work, I couldn't focus. I found myself zoning out, not hearing what my colleagues were saying, missing meetings, losing track of conversations. I would sit in front of my computer, but all I could think about was James. His kiss, the quiet conversations, the city at night, even the calm discussions with Ethan in the car. I wanted to run to the bathroom and cry. Let it all out. Release everything that had been building up inside. But I couldn't allow myself that weakness. I couldn't let anyone see how much this was consuming me. One evening, Ethan suggested we take a couple of days at our country house, our peaceful retreat in the woods by a lake. I agreed, thinking that a change of scenery might help me find some clarity. The next day, we packed up and left the city behind. As we drove away, I felt a little lighter, as if leaving the questions behind could help ease the weight on my mind. At the cabin, Ethan lit the fireplace and we sat together under a blanket, just like we used to. We talked about everything except what really mattered. He told me stories about work and I listened, but my thoughts were far away, scattered. The next morning, I woke early and went to the lake. The water was dark and still, mirroring the gray sky above. I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I wanted to feel something. Anger, relief, joy, anything, but instead I felt empty, as though I had lost my way and didn't know how to find my way back. Ethan joined me, wrapping his arms around me from behind, and we stood there in silence for several minutes. I felt his warmth, his presence, but my mind was still on James, and the feelings he had stirred within me. "Are you thinking about him?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice calm without any trace of reproach or jealousy, just a quiet understanding. I wanted to lie, but I couldn't. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady. "But it's not about him. It's about what this means for me." Ethan nodded, as if he had been expecting that answer. We went back to the cabin, and he made coffee while I sat at the table, listening to the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker. We didn't need to speak. He knew I was searching for something, and he didn't rush me. Those days at the cabin felt like a brief pause in the storm. I realized that, despite all the uncertainty, Ethan and I had grown closer. But I also knew our journey was just beginning. We would have to find a balance between what we were searching for and what we already had. When we returned to the city, I felt that the time away had helped me sort through my thoughts, but the question still lingered. There was still that nagging uncertainty, and a strange sense of guilt toward Ethan, unspoken but hanging between us. We began to live as though we were on parallel paths, close but still apart. Ethan understood me like no one else. One evening he suggested we meet James again, not because he was pushing me into it, but because he saw that I was still lost in my thoughts. He wanted me to find answers, even if it meant seeing the man who had stirred up this storm inside me. And despite my own doubts, I agreed. We chose a neutral place, a modern art gallery. I didn't know why there, but something about it felt right. Art always involves searching, feeling, experiencing. Maybe, among the paintings and sculptures, I'd find a piece of myself. James arrived early and was waiting for us at the entrance. His eyes still held the same calmness I remembered from our first meeting. But now there was something else. He had become a symbol of my own journey, a symbol of my need to rediscover who I was. We exchanged greetings, but there was no need for small talk. Ethan hung back, giving me the space I needed. James and I moved quietly through the gallery, observing abstract paintings bursting with colors and chaotic lines. I had always thought art was supposed to explain something, but here in these rooms it only raised more questions, just like my life felt at that moment. In one of the rooms, surrounded by massive canvases, James stopped suddenly and turned to face me. There was something new in his eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a deeper desire to understand. He stepped closer, his movements decisive, as though he knew exactly what needed to be done. "I think you're holding back a lot," he said softly, almost a whisper. His words weren't mocking. They were filled with understanding. "You're not afraid of me," he continued. "You're afraid of yourself." Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I couldn't find the words to respond, so I just nodded slowly because deep down I knew he was right. I was scared of what I had discovered inside myself and what that discovery might lead to. James moved closer again, and this time the kiss was different. It wasn't gentle or soft. It was intense, a collision of emotions, sharp, raw, and full of passion. I felt my hands grip his shoulders as he pulled me closer, as though we were both trying to escape our inner turmoil in that kiss. It was like a whirlwind, pulling us into a moment where everything else faded away. But then just as suddenly I pulled away, as if something inside me said, "That's enough." I took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. The confidence was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. And I realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about me. In that kiss I felt both my fear and my freedom. I was terrified of how far I could allow myself to go, but I also knew I needed to stop. I stepped back, and James let me go without a word. He understood. This wasn't just about us. We were both on separate journeys, seeking something, but we had reached a boundary that didn't need to be crossed. When I returned to Ethan, he looked up at me, and without asking a single question, he understood everything by the look on my face. I sat down beside him, and he took my hand, squeezing it gently, as if afraid I might slip away again. We sat together in the gallery, surrounded by paintings full of color and silent screams, and for the first time, I felt a sense of relief. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice full of tenderness. "Yes," I replied, and this time my words were true. I had come to understand that I needed time, but I also knew what I didn't want. Ethan nodded and pulled me close. In that moment, I understood that our journey was only just beginning, and there would be many more twists and turns ahead. But we were in this together. We were still learning. Learning how to love, learning how to trust, and most importantly, learning how to be honest with ourselves. After the gallery, Ethan and I returned home, but something had shifted. Our apartment, once just a place to rest, now felt like something more. It had become the space where a new chapter of our lives was beginning. Every item, from the old books to the paintings on the walls, now felt like part of our shared journey. And although this wasn't the path I had expected to walk, it felt as though we were finally moving in the right direction. Ethan stayed by my side through it all. He never pushed me, never demanded explanations, and never asked the questions I couldn't answer. He had become a quiet witness to my search, and I knew it wasn't easy for him. We often sat in silence in the evenings, sometimes talking about trivial things, or watching old movies we used to love, finding comfort in those small moments. It was a strange but peaceful feeling rediscovering each other. It was during this time that we met Rachel and Henry. They too were looking to explore new horizons in their relationship, and soon we became close friends. Rachel was bright, energetic, and wise, with a glint in her eyes that suggested she had seen the world beyond its surface. Henry, on the other hand, was calm, thoughtful, a grounding force. They were the perfect balance to each other. We often met at a cozy cafe, where we could sip cappuccinos and talk openly, without fear of being judged. Rachel and I shared our fears, hopes, and doubts, and she always seemed to find the words that helped restore my confidence. She told me how she and Henry had also gone through difficult times when they wondered whether to keep exploring or return to their old lives. But, she said, every time they faced those doubts, they came out stronger on the other side. The most important thing, she told me one afternoon as we sat in the park, basking in the autumn sun, is honesty. You can make mistakes, take a few steps back. But as long as you keep talking and don't hide your feelings, everything will be okay. Her words stayed with me. I realized that this journey wasn't just about new experiences and emotions. It was about being vulnerable with the people we loved. I opened up to Ethan, telling him about my doubts and the fears that had been tormenting me. He listened quietly without interruption, and squeezed my hand tighter, as though silently assuring me that he was there, no matter what. Ethan and I began spending more time with Rachel and Henry. We had dinners, played board games, talked about books and movies, but most importantly, we became part of something bigger. A community of people who, like us, were trying to understand their feelings and relationships. Every meeting felt like a small therapy session, a space where we could speak freely and be understood. One evening, we hosted them at our place. The evening didn't go as planned. Our lasagna burned and a storm knocked out the power. But instead of ruining the night, it turned into something special. We lit candles, laughed, drank wine, and shared stories of our lives. Rachel told us how she and Henry had decided to travel through Europe, quitting their jobs to rediscover each other in a new light. Henry just smiled quietly, confirming every word she said. And in their eyes I saw something precious, deep understanding and acceptance. As I sat next to Ethan, I felt my fears slowly melt away. We were surrounded by people who genuinely supported us and didn't judge our choices. It was the kind of support that gives you the strength to keep going, even when the future seems uncertain. After everyone had left, Ethan and I were cleaning up the kitchen when he stopped, looked at me, and without a word pulled me close. We stood there in the dim glow of the candles, the world outside silent. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that, despite all the confusion and uncertain steps we had taken, we were still together. "Thank you for being here," he whispered, and I knew those words meant more than just gratitude. In that moment, I understood that our journey wasn't just about seeking new experiences, but about returning to ourselves, finding each other again. It was a path we were walking together, even if sometimes we had to take different routes to get there.